It is very important to better understand the sources of disinformation, the intentions, tools, and objectives behind it, how and why citizens are drawn to disinformation narratives in order to acknowledge our own vulnerability. As I have previously mentioned, the current health crisis proved once again the impact of disinformation campaigns, testing the trust and patience of our societies. Freedom of thought, of speech, respect for the rule of law and for human rights, all these elements that are essential to democracy are tested through disinformation campaigns. Strong commitment and swift actions are needed to tackle and expose those involved in disturbing the already existing democratic norms. This is a critical area of shared institutional responsibility to preserve the democratic process and the trust of citizens in public institutions at both national and international level. There can be no peace, no democracy, and no security in a world dominated by disinformation. Dear participants, however, when the threat is widespread and affects a lot of states, targets alliances and international institutions, national responses are essential, but they may not be enough. Romania is a constant and promoter of an effective multilateral approach based on the respect for international law. We also advocate for the development and implementation of common narratives and tools for countering infodemics. We are convinced that strong multilateral partnerships and cooperation, complementing national strategies to forecast, address, and respond to disinformation activities, can significantly improve our democratic response to foreign informational threats. Cooperation with international organizations and entities, with regional and multinational institutions, in order to address common challenges is essential in the context of infodemics. We should step up our solidarity and fight together against hybrid attacks, including attacks using disinformation. When it comes to shared values, there is a real opportunity in developing common narratives and joint campaigns with partner nations. Just as important is to work with the tech and media sector companies operating at global level to ensure that citizens' rights, including those related to access to accurate information and security, are taken into account. Ladies and gentlemen, for all these reasons, the Romanian presidency of the Community of Democracies will further support the continuation of the series of events on countering malign foreign interference in democracies. We consider it a very useful platform for debating this trans-border issue, and we already see practical results. The Community of Democracies serves as an excellent framework for this purpose, as we share a genuine interest in the integrity of democratic institutions and processes in societies run by the rule of law. Let me thank you for your commitment, your willingness, and your dedication to shore up the very sociable foundations upon which democracy rests. Thank you. I would like now to invite the Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, Mr. Thomas Garrett, to take the floor. And I use this opportunity to address our gratitude to him and his team for the assiduous work in the service of our community, and for the valuable support offered to the Romanian presidency of the Community of Democracies. Mr. Secretary General, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister Orescu, and I want to also thank Romania for its leadership as President of the Community of Democracies. Let me also say thank you to the United States Department of State for their financial support to this project. Distinguished speakers, friends, good morning, good afternoon, and even, I think, good evening zones that are gathered here today. On behalf of the Community of Democracies, I want to welcome you to this virtual event, Countering Malign Foreign Influence aimed at undermining democratic institutions and norms. In June of this year, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Community of Democracies. And in that celebration, we reflected on the universality and importance of the 19 principles of democracy and human rights that were established in the Warsaw Declaration. The Warsaw Declaration recognizes democratic values such as free and fair elections, the freedom of opinion and expression, the right of the press to collect, report, and disseminate information news and opinions, and also transparent, participatory, and fully accountable government institutions. And so while progress has been made in the last 20 years, since 106 nations adopted the Warsaw Declaration, we see examples of democratic transitions in many countries across the globe. Yet we also see ever-growing challenges as authoritarian regimes grow more active and manipulative in their efforts to undermine democratic institutions and norms, including the use of new technologies and through social media. As the foreign minister mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has also created new opportunities for malign foreign actors to attempt to undermine democratic societies. So while there are many reasons to be concerned, we hope the conversation that we have today will not only help us draw attention to these malign activities, strategies, and tactics, but also we should discuss the available tools and frameworks that have been successfully used to ensure democracy's resilience and to counterbalance the efforts to undermine our cherished democratic institutions. I look forward to this conversation, and I return the floor to you, Foreign Minister Orescu. Thank you.
Topic. I reassure you once again of our support and of Romania's commitment to the work of our community. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, I have now the pleasure to give the floor to Mrs. Kara MacDonald, Deputy Assistant Secretary, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor in the U.S. Department of State, to address her message.
Fericit pentru acest eveniment și pentru președinția română. Foreign Minister Orescu, Secretary General Garrett, distinguished speakers, panelists, and guests, it's a pleasure to be with you virtually today. Thank you to the Community of Democracies Presidency of Romania and the Permanent Secretariat for organizing this timely and important discussion on a critical challenge facing all democracies. Democracy remains an aspiration of people throughout the world. There is no better form of government for promoting and protecting the human rights, equality, and dignity of every person, and for fostering peace, security, and prosperity globally. However, sustaining democracy requires stewardship, hard work, and vigilance. Democracy faces increasing challenges globally. In 2020, Freedom House marked the 14th consecutive year of global decline in civil and political liberties. The Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index recorded the lowest average global score for democracy since the index began in 2006. And the VDEM Institute declared that for the first time since 2001, autocracies are in the majority. These authoritarian governments are not only increasing repression at home, but also engage in malign behavior abroad to undercut democratic gains around them. They seek to weaken democratic institutions and erode trust in democratic principles. They attempt to make a weakness of freedoms the essential strength of democracy by exploiting the free and open rules of our own national democratic governments and of the international rules-based order. They hope to reshape the international system to favor their authoritarian aims. Malign activities by Russia, the People's Republic of China, and increasingly Iran threaten to weaken long-established democracies and impede democratic progress. Russia's malign influence campaigns target the security, political stability, social cohesion, and economic prosperity of democratic states. Russia continues the Soviet Union's Cold War legacy of subversive activities, including propaganda and disinformation, interfering in electoral processes, promoting corrupt practices and economic pressure tactics, creating autocratic norms and models adopted by other repressive regimes, and amplifying fringe voices that advocate violence and racism. Russia is also exploiting new technologies that increase the volume and velocity of Moscow's malign messaging and permit remote network penetration and large-scale data leaks, rapid and opaque money transfers, and remote threats to critical infrastructure. These campaigns risk sowing discord in and among democratic societies. But these tactics are not unique to Russia. Beijing seeks to disrupt and reshape the international environment around the authoritarian thinking of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. It does this by manipulating international organizations, silencing critics abroad, applying diplomatic pressure through economic debt, and spreading disinformation. The CCP targets democratic societies through a variety of organizations, including state-owned or state-controlled media outlets, Confucius Institutes, United Front organizations, and more. The aims of its propaganda and disinformation campaigns include legitimizing control by the CCP, misrepresenting the aims or consequences of policies like its One Belt, One Road initiative, marginalizing Taiwan, and deflecting international attention from human rights abuses in Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and elsewhere throughout China. Iran, too, is a leading malign actor in cyberspace in particular, and uses cyber activities both against its own people and entities and individuals beyond its borders. Iran increasingly deploys its cyber capabilities to identify and silence regime critics and to spread disinformation, most notably seen during nationwide protests in November 2019, when the regime instituted an internet blackout to silence critics and disrupt protests. Iran has also deployed its army of cyber hackers against Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, and to attack U.S. financial institutions in 2017. And they are actively seeking to interfere with the U.S. 2020 election. Iran's cyber activity threatens access to an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet. Since early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has further stressed democratic resilience, as the foreign minister said, and provided new opportunities for these and other actors to advance geopolitical aims through malign influence activities. Exploiting uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, they fuel disinformation, silence truth tellers, and use the pandemic as a new tool of repression. In response to this authoritarian assault, the Community of Democracies is uniquely placed to strengthen resilience and help inoculate all democracies against tactics to undermine democratic principles and institutions. Governments, likewise, can do this through sustained commitment to the Warsaw Declaration principles. Transparent, inclusive, and accountable governments that promote and protect the rule of law, foster public trust and legitimacy, two sources of resilience to malign influence. States can also raise awareness in all sectors of their societies to the threat and intentions of these malign operations. This should include outreach and collaboration with civil society, business, academia, and subnational governments. This also means ensuring approaches to countering malign influence do not inadvertently abuse or violate human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of expression, both online and offline. Fostering a free, independent, and transparent media environment enables individuals and media organizations to access multiple sources of information, to assess the origins and motivations of these sources, and to make informed judgments. Misinformation and propaganda are vanquished by more freedom, not less. Together, we must work to foster this democratic resilience. We must expose these negative authoritarian agendas and activities for what they are. We must share best practices for spotting and responding, and we must impose costs on the actors that carry them out. The United States welcomes the Community of Democracies' convening role in taking on this challenge. Together, we can preserve the democratic principles and institutions that serve as a powerful counter to the authoritarian narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. McDonald, for your very kind words, as well as for your participation and for your very valuable contribution. I would like now to invite Mr. Christopher Walker, Vice President of Studies and Analysis with the National Endowment for Democracy, to share his expert view on the topic. Mr. Walker, the floor is yours.
So I'd like to thank, first of all, Foreign Minister Orescu and also Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, Tom Garrett, for the invitation to speak with you today. This is such a critical and timely topic. And before we get to our great panelists, I'm going to offer some framing remarks for just a few minutes to provide some context to the challenge we face. And part of what I'll be saying will build on what the other speakers have touched on so far. And I think what I would emphasize right at the outset, that the past 15 years have been what Larry Diamond calls a period of democratic recession. But it's also been a period of authoritarian resurgence. And to put these developments into context, if you think about the last 30-year period after the Cold War, Now, almost half of that period, you look at Freedom House data, has us in democratic recession. And I think it's fair to say that if we step back and looked at this from a broader context, the democracies really have underestimated the challenge that's been presented by the authoritarian resurgence and the exertion of malign influence that's accompanied it. If we had this conversation a decade ago, or possibly even more recently than that, the issue of countering malign foreign influence simply would not have been a central focus of discussion. So what's changed during this time? I'm going to touch on 4 factors of particular relevance. These aren't exhaustive by any means, but in my view, they're critical to understanding the challenge. And that is the changing dimensions of corruption, information, technology, and global norms. And so the first issue I'll touch on, and I'd really stress that the challenge of authoritarian malign influence can't be limited to information and disinformation. And so I'm going to start with this corruption issue and use the framing of this by what my colleagues at the Center for International Private Enterprise call corrosive capital. I think what's so important to understand in this context is that in an era of deep economic and political intersection between democracies and autocracies, corrosive capital is capital that flows from authoritarian regimes that undermines democratic processes and institutions in the receiving countries. It should be understood as a form of strategic corruption that differs from other forms of corruption in that it's backed and sometimes orchestrated by a state power for political rather than economic goals, or to advance a comprehensive authoritarian agenda with inseparable political and economic objectives. China, for instance, through the BRI and other forms of economic and political engagement, is placing increasing importance on exerting influence and reshaping the political operating environment beyond its borders. As China specialist Nadège Roland observes, the Chinese authorities do not use the BRI primarily as a physical infrastructure project. Rather, she says, it is a multi-dimensional strategy that advances China's notion of itself as an uncontested leading power. The second domain that I'm going to touch on is news and information. And I think it's fair to say that in the past 15 years, the environment for independent news and information has undergone sweeping and in many ways devastating changes. And these have been incredibly trying for the ability of news organizations and open societies to do their work in a sustainable way. Edward Lucas, in a report that we published in February of this year, looked at how authoritarian influence is increasingly exploiting media vulnerability in open societies. And he does a terrific job of explaining how Russia in particular disrupts and subverts the information space. And he points out that Russian disinformation over the recent years with more intensity has constituted a relentless multidimensional attack on the prestige of democracies, which is focused on, but it's not limited to, the United States and European Union countries. China, which really wasn't seen as a meaningful actor in the disinformation space until very recently, has developed its own capacity, its authorities and surrogates, to exert meaningful impact on the information space and shaping narratives and otherwise distorting and manipulating the information environment. And as the foreign minister had pointed out, the global pandemic has offered new opportunities in this domain, especially for authoritarian regimes to double down on their own approach, with China in particular seizing on new methods of narrative competition. The third domain I would emphasize, which I think is distinct but still integrally related to the media and news domain, is that of technology. Authoritarian regimes possess a keen appreciation of information as a source of power, and therefore they've prioritized the technology domain. The growing interdependence of autocratic and democratic information sources and platforms has enabled authoritarians a much stronger hand in setting rules of expression. Today's ubiquitous instant communication tools have opened up unexpected avenues for the manipulation of everything from political opinion, political processes, and democratic institutions. And digitally connected citizens increasingly are getting their news from social media platforms, which presents some meaningful opportunities that are quite positive. But I think it's fair to say that given the persistent vulnerabilities of these platforms, they continue to be exploited in some very troubling ways. I won't go into great detail on this now. We see this on a daily basis, and I think our speakers will touch on this. But I think what I would stress in this context, and this touches on both the strategic corruption, the news and information, and the technology domains, is that authoritarian trendsetters have adapted their domestic techniques in these domains for international application. And this is something that democratic societies are still catching up with. And these internationally applied techniques that are being used by the authoritarians are increasingly jeopardizing the integrity of democratic states everywhere. And finally, I'm just going to say a very quick word about the norms domain, which I think gets inadequate attention, but really deserves some focus. This touches on so many aspects of the democratic health and the democratic trajectory of the democratic community in this discussion. But I'm just going to emphasize a couple of issues that I think are particularly important. And one is that authoritarian regimes see regional and international rules-based bodies as a threat to their regime interests. And so they focus their attention on hobbling the democracy and human rights components of institutions that are critical for safeguarding democratic standards. This includes everything from the ODIHR and the OSCE, the OAS, UN bodies that are relevant to everything from maritime issues to internet and digital issues to the Human Rights Council. And for more than a decade now, this has been a very important point of focus of a wide range of authoritarian regimes, including but not limited to China and Russia. And I think we've underestimated the impact this has had at reshaping the discussion, the narrative, and the norm-setting agenda at a strategic level. The focus of these efforts isn't simply to defend authoritarianism at home, but I would contend it's to reshape international norms that stigmatize such governance. The University of Chicago's Law School's Tom Ginsberg, who's just written a terrific piece in the October issue of the Journal of Democracy, makes a very compelling argument that autocracies in recent years have emerged as a driving force in crafting international legal norms, something that he argues was not anticipated coming out of the 1990s. So let me just conclude my initial remarks by noting that, as I started, by saying that we remain in the midst of a period that both has democratic recession and authoritarian resurgence. And in an era of global and political and economic intersection, these two top-line trends intersect more than we have acknowledged until very recently. And in contending with external and internal challenges, especially in the tech and information realms, it would be wrong to describe the democracies, their governments, and civil societies as facing a simple choice between either addressing authoritarian intrusions or strengthening the integrity of critical democratic institutions. I'd contend that we need to view the challenge of countering malign foreign influence and strengthening the democratic resilience of our societies as two sides of a coin. I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, and now I'd like to turn the discussion to our superb lineup of speakers, and we're going to go in the order they appear in the agenda that's been submitted. And so I'm going to start with Sim Kumpas, and I'm not going to do long introductions. You have their bios. I'm just going to give their titles and affiliations. So very pleased to introduce Mr. Sim Kumpas, who's Strategic Communications Advisor of the Government of Estonia. And I think it's worth noting that in the context of the larger malign foreign influence discussion, in some ways, if you don't include Russia's annexation of Crimea as kind of the point on the timeline that really got us to sit up straight and take notice, it was the cyber attack that's widely understood to have been organized and originated from the Russian Federation that Estonia suffered. And so I'm going to pose the first question in this context to Mr. Kumpas, and that is, Estonia was named the most advanced digital society in the world, with 99% of governmental services being online. What can you tell us about the strategies and tools that Estonia has used to build its resilience to external threats from authoritarian influences that aim to weaken the trust in democratic institutions?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor. Yeah, you're absolutely spot on in saying that basically all public services in Estonia are also available online. There are a few exceptions. You cannot get merit online. You cannot do your conscription online, and some of the obvious things, of course. But other than that, more or less everything is available digitally as well. And I think it's good that you mentioned 2007 and the infamous soldier riot here in Tallinn, Estonia. It looked pretty strange back in those days because Tallinn is a nice quiet city, and if you hadn't seen what happened 13 years ago here on our streets, it would almost sound impossible in Estonia, but it happened, and it was, to an extent, it was a necessary wake-up call. Because on the one hand, Estonia has been we are situated next to Russia, so you know how our neighbor operates, and we've seen their activities since 1991, since we regained our independence. But what happened in 2007 really made us reassess how we see their activities, and strategic communications is one of the 6 pillars in our security thinking in Estonia. So we see on a kind of a government level strategic point of view, strategic communications is one of the key elements of our security here in Estonia. So that is ingrained in all high-level policy documents, and that's where it starts. This means there is a wide mandate for us to work on this. We have a team at government office level, which I'm a part of as well, and it starts to drill down there. And when it comes to informational influence, I think it's very good what Mr. Walker mentioned earlier. We shouldn't limit our focus to disinformation or even informational influence. More generally, it's about influence activities more broadly, and informational influence is just part of it. And our way to address it can be either reactive or proactive. And I think they complement each other. We do need reactive responses. We do need to check facts, debunk, etc. But that's just kind of first aid, I would say. Looking longer run, we need a proactive response, which in our case, Estonia boils down largely to 3 or 4 key elements. One of them is situational awareness, so understanding what's happening in the media sphere, social media sphere, and also our society more broadly. So it's about running public opinion surveys, doing research, etc. Secondly, when we have operational picture, then we need to keep an optimum level of threat awareness. And it cannot be too low, because otherwise people won't understand why we do what you do, and we want to keep it from too high as well, because we don't want people to panic. So it's about keeping it just at the sweet spot, somewhere in the middle. And based on that, we can start building awareness. We can start training our necessary officials, both in ministries and also on a local level. We can start building training programs for our universities, etc. the next kind of layer, I would say, is media literacy and everything that comes with it. It really needs to be ingrained in our educational programs. In our case, for example, we have a 35-hour course on media and manipulation that's compulsory for high school students. And I see this just a start because we need to start media literacy from much earlier on, and it needs to be all encompassing. I like the way that the UK is thinking about adding media literacy as a fourth main element of education next to reading, writing, and mathematics. I actually see it as essential as that. And lastly, it's also about having an independent and pluralistic media environment from distance. This is somewhere where the government really doesn't have much to do. One of the ways to guarantee that government is to keep as far away from the media landscape as possible. That said, I do think there are some ways that don't cross the line of freedom of speech that can really help along the media sector as well, be it some kind of funding grants or whatever else. So yeah, that is a very short introduction to how we see building societal resilience and informational influence here in Estonia. I'm going to stop here and be happy to take questions afterwards if there are any. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sim Kumpas, for that. I think you framed so many of the issues extremely well. And of course, Estonia is not only on the front lines, but it's really been at the cutting edge of the response to this. And so let me take this opportunity. It's a perfect segue to turn to Nina Jankovic, who is Global Fellow at the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center, and she's been doing such terrific work on this issue. Her book is fabulous for those who haven't seen it. And I'm just going to ask her if she would say a word about how she views this issue of enduring information vigilance as part of a response to this ongoing challenge we face. That's so dynamic in its own right because the technology and the information flows are changing. Could you just give us a sense of how you think we should think about this, and then we'll turn to Karina.
Chris, Foreign Minister Orescu, Secretary General Garrett, and Das McDonald, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm really happy to hear that today's conversation so far has centered so much on building awareness, resilience, and citizens-based solutions to disinformation. That is usually my whole dog and pony show and everything that I talk about. So it is so good to hear such an emphasis on that, because my research shows that it is key in gaining ground in the information war. Chris, as for your question, this is related to a paper that I recently published in the U.S. Army War College's Parameters Quarterly Journal, together with Henry Collis, who works for the UK government. He's the Deputy Director for National Security Communications at number 10 Downing Street. And it looks at how adversaries, in particular Russia and China, have been using information operations to exploit open societies and undermine our shared democratic values. And our conclusion is that when we're thinking about the responses to these issues, and many of our speakers have already touched on this today, those democratic values, our shared democratic values, must be the center of gravity for any of our approaches to countering disinformation. And over the past couple of months, we've seen how China and Russia have domestically, in their own internal communications, really clamped down on information about the coronavirus, about infection rates, things like that, while very, opportunistically exploiting the openness of our societies, exploiting the fact that we do know what our government's responses look like. We do, have opportunities to criticize, and they are using, again, those opportunities in order to inject some very divisive rhetoric in our societies, in addition to, with some amount of hubris, injecting their own positive narratives. So we've not heard yet about the way that China has used mask diplomacy. Russia has done this to some extent as well, not only here in the United States, but in Europe, certainly in Africa. This isn't disinformation, but it's certainly a way to really influence the conversation. And you mentioned enduring information vigilance. The point that Henry and I tried to make in this paper is that you know, Russia and China are operating on all cylinders all the time across all of their sectors, not just in government, not just in the national security sector, as we so often see the disinformation conversation cordoned off, but outside of government, into NGOs, into criminal hacking organizations and things like that. And so we need to arrange our own Western response to reflect how our adversaries are coming at this problem. And so one of the things that we need to do is look at the way the government is structured and really reflect that all cylinders all the time approach. We have 3 C's. This is, you know, an easy way to remember the way we think things should be structured here. The first one is building capability beyond discrete campaigns. We've been talking a lot about media literacy in general publics. I think we also need to work very directly at educating our civil servants as well, making sure that civil servants understand how disinformation works, why they are a target for disinformation, how things like cyber attacks and hack and leak operations feed disinformation. And of course, there are extreme targets for that. We know that cyber attacks, even if you have the best IT security in the world, if you have a human weak link in your cyber chain, that's often how these cyber attacks begin. So really building that capability within government, so that then the different nodes of government that are working on counter-disinformation policy are all operating on the same wavelength and understand the utility of cooperating and working together. That is the second C, cooperation. You know, hostile states have the potential to exploit the inability of Western governments to work effectively across government. And I've seen this in my work in Ukraine when I was advising the foreign ministry there under a Fulbright. We see it here to some extent in the United States. While we have really great responses across our government, I would love to see them joined up by a central node in government. And that coordination could happen in other Western governments as well to a greater extent. So making sure that we have that central hub, ideally an expert body that is not staffed with political appointees, something that will outlast any administration that creates it, is extraordinarily important. And also making sure that across government we are joined up in our monitoring, in our messaging and policy making, which of course we just heard about from Estonia. They are one of the exemplary examples for this sort of joined up approach. And then again, I've mentioned this a little bit before, but it's so important that in these responses, we're reaching beyond the traditional national security community. Of course, these are national security problems, but we also need ministries of culture, ministries of education in the room, the people who are actually working with those that are most vulnerable to disinformation. We need to include them as well and think beyond our traditional national security structures. And then finally, and I can't think of a better place to deliver this particular point, we need to strengthen our international cooperation, the third C, making sure that we're building international partnerships. We are stronger with our democratic allies. And so joining together to think of regulatory and policy approaches, fora like the Community of Democracies are great places to do that, making sure that we are sharing our intelligence and monitoring of these situations so that we're all aware of coming threats and we're not taken aback. We are responding proactively rather than reactively to ongoing adversarial campaigns, and also working together to impose costs on adversaries is extremely important, and fora like this allow us to do that. And then finally, just to bring it back to the media literacy question, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention it today, and in an audience that I think really understands the value of building awareness in society. Setting up a response like that, that is joined up, that creates the structure necessary so that government can really join together and fire on all cylinders in response to this problem, allows us to do that hard work of building societal resilience. We also, in addition to reaching folks who are in school still, K through 12 and beyond, we need to reach voting age adults. The employee civil servants training program is one way to do that. I would love to see more cooperation with the private sector, using the ubiquity of social media in order to reach out and reach people who might not necessarily get that information, using libraries and civil society organizations that are doing good work in this area. And investing in public media, of course, is extremely important in that degree. And I know those that are gathered here today believe that as well. So I'll just leave you with a quote from Thomas Jefferson that I think, frankly, is a great encapsulation of where we stand and how this has always been a problem to some extent. He says, or wrote in 1820, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education." Thanks a lot, and I look forward to further discussion.
So thank you so much for that, Nina. You've given so much fodder for thought. I have too many questions, and I'll be able to squeeze into our follow-up, and we'll get a little bit in before we move to the next segment. But I want to turn now to Corina Rebeggia, who's the director of the Democratic Resilience Unit at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, such a wonderful organization. And I'd like to ask you, Corina, right now in the midst of the pandemic, there are many governments that are taking steps to further restrict the information domain, using that as a rationale for restricting this space. And this is not helping the information environment. So I just want to ask you, what lessons should free societies draw from the pandemic experience that would allow them to build resilience rather than to see it erode? And what top order suggestions might you have in that respect?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for such a great conversation already. I would perhaps structure my answer in two ways. Looking first at the more general lessons we've learned, and some of the previous speakers have already alluded to that, and then going to more specific issues that came up particularly this year in the time of crisis. And I think one important point to be made about this year is that, as the other speakers have alluded to, that the crisis reinforced and accentuated some of the trends that we've already seen, and also our reliance on digital technologies. And it has also reinforced the areas where we haven't really done the work. And I think it was such a clear mirror presented to democratic societies of the things that where we still have a lot to catch up on when it comes to fending off adversarial state interference. So with that, even before the crisis, we knew that the way that authoritarian states work is by reinforcing a vicious circle of domestic and international authoritarianism and bad governance and corruption. And I'm really glad you mentioned that, Chris, because I think that's one of my pet topics. So the crisis really exposed where we are weak and the structural problems that we have in terms of governance. And this is important because we've seen how our health systems are weak, how our education systems are weak, how our political systems are weak, how our procurement systems are weak, and sometimes how our rule of law and checks and balances are very, very fragile. And this is important because this has an impact on the demand for disinformation. And I think we haven't spent enough time looking at what demand for disinformation means, in that there has been research looking at the cognitive side, there has been less research looking at the societal side of things, and how the poor performance of governments actually fuels this demand. And the weakening of trust and the increased polarization that make our domestic audiences more vulnerable to foreign malign interference. And of course, our populations, our citizens have already been primed by so many disinformation campaigns and information manipulation in the past that whatever happened this year with the infodemics, as the WHO defined it, found a very fertile ground. And then kind of the other big lesson that we learned this year is that that was reinforced, is that we're losing the narrative battle. Even in cases where we shouldn't. There's a saying that goes, do good and talk about it. And I think that was so much at play this year during the pandemic crisis in Europe, where the European Union was providing, even though, you can claim that they were late, but they were providing so much assistance to countries, both financial and in other ways. And the campaigns that we were actually seeing were those coming from Russia and more so from China. And I think we have a really good example in the Western Balkans, in Serbia, with the big billboards thanking China for really nothing. So with that, what have we learned in more concrete ways? And I think there are two dimensions that are really important, and the third one where I think it's where my hopes are, and that's civil society. But first, on the regulatory side, and I think that's where your question about sort of the narrowing space for civil society and media freedom comes from, Chris. So some of the measures we've seen this year have to do with taking down websites and limiting press freedom. And that has been a trend that developed globally and in many European states, and some of them actually coming again onto a wave of more repressive actions from governments. And by repressive, I mean ways in which the media market is being constricted and independent media is not being allowed to do its work. So the lesson I think that we've learned here is that this is going to backfire. And it's going to backfire in a couple of ways. One is a temporary fix. So a lot of the websites, even though they were conspiracy websites and they were perhaps spreading disinformation, they popped up back online, and not just those, but others as well. So this is not really solving the problem. And perhaps a better way of going about this is really defining what, and we're still lagging behind, defining and educating the public on what media really is, and not allowing offshore and dirty money to fund these operations. And second, the way it backfired is that civil society and media organizations distrusted the government even more. And governments really need these allies, particularly in time of crisis, to fight conspiracies and disinformation. And I think one of the great lessons of this year was the ability of civil society organizations to mobilize and provide services across a broad spectrum of issues, from emergency relief to combating disinformation, educating the public, and so on. And then secondly, related to this, is that we need more sources of authoritative information. And I think Minister Aurescu talked about this a little bit. And some of the studies that came out looking at the space of misinformation and disinformation this year showed that mainstream actors and voices actually played a really big role in spreading disinformation around the pandemic. So I think, looking at the hygiene of our public discourse, as Ina was mentioning, in terms of public officials, politicians, influencers, and so forth, is important, but also in terms of transparency and access to information, something that was cut during the state of emergencies in many countries, where civil society and media did not have access to adequate, timely information about what was happening. And one thing that is also that came out during the pandemic, as I mentioned before, is that we haven't done our homework in thinking about the regulations we need to put forth when it comes to online campaigning and advertising, as well as mainstreaming human rights more in our approach to dealing with regulation of this space. For instance, looking more at transparency and creating publicly available databases for these ads, we're still lagging behind. Offshoreization of media investments and also deterring economic profiteering from sensationalist and false content, something that I think we're also lagging behind in terms of regulation. But moving on to the private, and I'll end with this, something that we've seen this year, and it's perhaps encouraging, is that platforms and internet companies can actually do a lot of things if they want to. And I think we can debate about the solutions that they've developed this year and their effectiveness, but I think it was also a good showcase of what can actually be done for content curation and moderation. So as well as labeling content, fake content, and banning political ads, and flagging false content, and just demoting content where possible, or removing ads from conspiracy websites so that the perpetrators of disinformation don't actually make money off of our attention. So I think if we look at all of these measures that were developed this year, as well as the increased cooperation that we've seen between platforms and researchers and governments, I think just to be hopeful, we can look at a variety of ways in which we can both regulate the space and better work together to improve the way these companies sort of affect the integrity of our democracies. And lastly, as I mentioned, I think the beacon of hope for this year were civil society organizations. And I think looking forward, we really need to think harder of how we engage NGOs into a lot of these responses when we talk about building resilience in terms of our democratic governance. Thank you.
So, Karina, I want to thank you so much for your observations, and really to all the speakers for offering such incredibly cogent remarks in such short order. I think what's so heartening about this discussion is that you can see the glass is half full, in the sense that there's quite meaningful mobilization, both at a civil society level and at a governmental level, to a lot of these challenges. I think Nina made the point that the authoritarians are operating on all cylinders. I like that expression. I think they're able to draw on so many resources across such a wide range of domains to pursue their objectives. And these days, they're doing that within open societies precisely because there's such intersection between autocracies and democracies. The glass is half full in the sense that our work is not done. And there needs to be much more integration, mobilization, cooperation, not only within democratic countries, civil societies and governments, but also across democratic governments, in the way that, for example, the G7's rapid response mechanism has done, and that should be encouraged. But other such initiatives should be developed in that vein. We are out of time for this part of the discussion, but I'm very pleased that we're going to now introduce two Community of Democracies partners into the discussion, and they'll join us to pose questions to the speakers. They'll be joining us in just a moment, I believe. Let me start by introducing Luis Consuegra of International IDEA, and if I'm not mistaken, he will pose a question to our speakers, and then we'll turn to one other questioner after Luis Consuegra poses his question. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, everyone, for such an enlightening conversation. There's a lot of fabric here to grasp on, and definitely this is the start of a very interesting conversation. Throughout the discussion, you touch on some of the mechanisms to prevent the undermining of democratic institutions. and of course on how global and regional organizations are perceived, especially those organizations that are working to support democracy and good governance worldwide, like the Community of Democracies, and in my case, like International IDEA. But in your opinion, what could be the role of global regional organizations to counter the attacks on democratic institutions and rules? We're talking about institutions that are creating knowledge, that are analyzing the current context, that are implementing development projects in support of institutions worldwide, but still we can see, based on this conversation, that they're under attack and under a great amount of criticism. So it would be interesting to see how do you think these organizations can ensure the political and financial support needed to achieve their mandate, and what should be the realistic expectation on what this multilateral action can achieve in the current context. Maybe a lot of questions, but all around the role of regional organizations and the UN, for example, right now in the margin of its 75th anniversary. So thank you very much.
So perhaps I'll suggest that you take those, the speakers take that question in order if Sim Kumpas wants to start.
Sure, thank you for the question. And it is a catchphrase that disinformation knows no borders, but it doesn't make it any less true. So we absolutely do need cooperation between countries bilaterally and multilaterally between bigger groups as well. And again, especially when we look at the current pandemic, for example, looking at the narratives hostile actors are using, they are pretty much the same all across the world. Sure, there are some regional nuances, but kind of the main elements in different countries, in very different regions of the world, tend to overlap quite a lot. And one of the key things to do jointly is to build a joint situational awareness. So understand what's happening, what is happening in different parts of the world. What are the methods, who are the actors, who are the target audiences, for example. Also sharing best practices and worst ones for that matter as well, because we all try different things. We tend to highlight the things that worked, but I think it's much more important to highlight things that didn't work, because we don't want our friends to step in the same buckets as we did, if possible. Also, what was mentioned earlier as well, if someone crosses lines that are kind of recognized by the international bodies as red lines, we need to sanction our adversaries, and we need to do it jointly. It doesn't work when a small country like Estonia tries to go against a big adversary. We need to do it jointly. Then, for example, our regulatory framework, which was already also mentioned. Again, it doesn't make sense for say 27 EU countries to try to regulate Facebook all by themselves. It would be a total mess for all of us and for the companies as well, and for, worst of all, for the users. So again, that's another thing we need to do jointly. There are some limits, I think. I personally don't, I'm not saying there is no merit to the idea, but I think joint campaigning can be a bit difficult at times, because it really boils down to trust, and international voices are not always the most trusted ones. The more local, the more trusted. Not always, but quite often. So I think there are limitations to joint campaigning, but again, even there is definitely some room for cooperation. So yeah, those are some of the main ideas that pop into mind thinking about multilateral cooperation. Happy to hear what the others have to say on this.
Nina?
Great, thanks. I think I'll just dive a little bit deeper into kind of the implementer space in particular. So for my previous work at the National Democratic Institute and also my time in Ukraine, And frankly, since then, looking at the disinformation and countering disinformation landscape among international implementers and donors, I think one of the functions that international organizations can play is a convening space and a coordinating function. There is a lot of duplication across this space. While there are more resources than there used to be because this issue has become more important to many governments, it would still be best if we were trying to make sure those resources were used the most wisely and coordinating where possible, not duplicating efforts. And I think that is one potential role for international organizations to play, to connect civil society organizations with donors, with each other, to make sure that we are maximizing the resources that we have available and targeting them to the things that are going to be most effective.
And Karina?
This is a great question. I would stress the importance of the transatlantic relationship. And I think the US and Canada and European Union working together, not only as a convening space or platform, but also in jointly creating norms, I think will go a long way in dealing with some of these issues. And unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of agreement at the moment. We have seen, for instance, the way in which regulations at the level of the European Union were able to set norms globally on privacy, on issues related to platforms. Even now, the European Commission, as you will know, is discussing a Digital Services Act that will have tremendous impact for companies all over the world. And I think making sure that we have better alignment between both sides of the Atlantic will go a long way. And you know, Chris mentioned the rapid response task force and the G7 involvement. I think also leveraging the multilateral formats will allow us to create more consensus around where the problem is, because I think this is where we're also lagging behind. There is agreement that there are malign actors out there that are trying to undermine our democracies, but I think when it comes to getting on the same page about definitions and how to go about responding or actually gaining initiative in this space, we still have a long way to go. And then something that I think needs reinforcing, and I'm so glad I've heard it so much in this conversation already, it's just addressing the different pillars of influence more comprehensively or together. And something that the EU and the US can do together is to look at regulation and adopting and implementing similar regulation that will cut actually the infrastructure or the supply lines for malign actors. And I'll give you just one example where I think cooperation is finally working, and that's Magnitsky legislation. And I think just using that model to work on other issues, I think will be beneficial.
Terrific. And I know we just have a few minutes left, and I'm going to take this opportunity to give the floor to Samuel Asante, who's the Community of Democracies Youth Lead in Ghana, and then we'll have an opportunity for brief responses from the speakers who would like to do that. Samuel Asante, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christopher. So my question is quite simple and straightforward. I was very much happy hearing Nina mention about having international cooperation in response to intelligence sharing and monitoring of the social media. And also, I was very much excited when I hear Sina also making mention about UK's policy when it comes to media literacy. Now, my question basically is, how can, let's say, developing countries in areas like in Africa, Southeast Asia, be able to use the social media space as a means to, let's say, counter the effect of foreign influence when it comes to disinformation during, let's say, election period or during, let's say, youth campaigning for systemic change like we see in Nigeria right now? are there any strategic ways that the citizens will be able to fish out this disinformation directly, or can they also work in conjunction with, let's say, systems within the country like government assistance to fish out this this sort of disinformation within the setting? Thank you.
Such an excellent question for our speakers to wrap things up on. So we can maybe go in reverse order this time. Nina, do you want to, or I'm sorry, Karina, why don't you take this one and we'll work our way back in the other direction very quickly, and then we'll wrap things up and hand them back over to Tom Garrett.
Well, thank you, Samuel, for this question. I think in a way you've answered your own question because you did mention cooperation between citizen groups or youth groups, governments, and internet companies. And I think there are some good practices that have developed over the past couple of years. And I'll give the example of the Paris Call Community on Election Interference that brings together a lot of these different groups to look at a very specific issue, and that's election interference. But I think in the way that citizens leverage social media, there are again a lot of good examples all over the world. And social media has been a place for rallying the troops, so to speak, and for keeping the civic energy alive, particularly during the pandemic. However, it's also the place where the civic space is actually being narrowed, and in the integrity of our democratic debate is being sort of hampered. So I think there is no easy answer to that other than what you just said, kind of keeping the civil groups at work and vigilant and continue to do the good work, but also work together with governments and media companies on the regulatory side to make sure that their efforts don't get lost in the chaos of information out there.
And let's turn to Nina.
Great. I'll just say one very quick thing, which is I think that we need to raise awareness in society about reporting mechanisms that exist on the platforms. When you see disinformation, when you see things that look potentially like a fake account, one of the best things that we can do is report them to the platforms, because hopefully eventually it will get reviewed by a human. But until that's the case, AI will be reviewing it, right? And that helps the platform learn about information that's useful and that's not. And very few people from the polling that I've looked at in a couple of different countries actually know about those reporting mechanisms. So raising awareness about that is important. It's also on the platforms to some extent to make those mechanisms easier to find in the user interface. That's all from me today. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you all.
Great. And now last quick word from Sim Kumpas.
Yeah, well, I think Karina and Nina covered most of it. Just to add one thing, as it really does boil down to trust. I think one of the key ways to get your message out is to establish trusted voices in your own country, in your own community. There is no universal answer to it. The situation is very different in different countries. It can be a government, usually it isn't, but it can in some cases. Usually it's the civil society. It can be the academia, the media, or another kind of element within the society. But I think if you manage to engage trusted voices within your own society, I think you're already taken a huge step in the right direction.
So I know we're right at the end of our time, so I'm just going to thank the speakers for wonderfully incisive responses to these big questions. Really put a lot of terrific ideas on the table in a very thoughtful and I think user-friendly way. And so I just want to thank them for that. And now I'm going to hand it back to the Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, Tom Garrett.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I want to join you in thanking our distinguished speakers, all of you, for sharing your thoughts today on this very important topic. I would encourage all of you who are participating today to join us tomorrow when we have session 2 of this dialogue, when we will focus on media freedom and fact-based reporting. Thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Great to see all of you. Take care.
You too, Chris. Thanks for
Bye.
having us.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Bye.
Yep.
Bye.